This is the Poyoes Cemetery, possibly the biggest cemetery in my town of San Sebastian, with 5.9 hectares square of surface. As the city of San Sebastian grew exponentially back in April 12, 1874, it was built under the demand of a great local cemetery, which was inaugurated in 1878 with a great obelisk commemorating its foundation. Here lie several illustrious figures in their final rest, such as a writer, politician, and defender of Spanish women's rights, Clara Campoamor here, who was key in the fight for suffrage here in Spain. Sadly, this graveyard is dense and overpopulated, especially after COVID-19 times where notably burials are rare and pretty damn expensive, not to mention the whole funerary and industrial complex. The cemetery is overflowing with graves, and this serves as a reminder that even big people and things will eventually have their day to lay their final rest 6 feet under. But you might be wondering, why is John Marie Arroyo Khan talking about this very particular cemetery when this video is about live service video games? Where the hell is my video? Well, video games, live service games especially, also die and have an immense graveyard to their names. And even late games like Concord are the Clara Campoamor of the immense game graveyard. Not to mention, these games are being killed killed by the sheer incompetence of the executives and shareholders that run the games industry, with huge victim names such as Concord, Lawbreakers, Brumblebirds, and so on, in hopes they either emulate the successful anomalies of the industry or die trying. Nobody wants to see their loved ones die in a grave, like they neither want to see their favorite games getting killed. Join me in this farewell for the final rest of the gaming industry's short-lived trend. This is an eulogy for live service games. But first, a bit of historical context. Since the inception of video games, gaming itself, as any other industry, is hyper focused on the idea of generating profit over any other product. From the old days of the arcades and the short lived Atari 2600 until today, there is always a way, a certain functionality in games of any era to extract as much revenue as possible. The arcades relied heavily on huge difficulty spikes and the graphics ahead of their time on their games to incentivize consumers to keep pouring in quarters into the arcade cabinet. So there was a constant flow of income not just to the arcades, but also to the game companies that sell those arcade cabinets. This was obviously cut short because of the coming of home consoles where people will prefer to keep an NES or Sega Genesis or a PlayStation at home and play games all they want without wasting so much pocket change in a very specific location. When I was young, our local mall had this arcade hall with games like Time Crisis and House of the Dead, where we usually frequented into sometimes, but eventually that business was not as profitable later, so it eventually closed down in its place, and this was a while ago in the public library until it was able to relocate to its original location. That was a prime example of how the arcade business model was pretty much short lived and will pretty much live on until the next hot game monetization model will come along way later. However, back in the 90s and the early 2000s, there were MMORPGs, the MMO craze, and MMO games were expensive to maintain, given to not just server maintenance, but also just given player capacity that servers will expect to have. So games like RuneScape or Ultima Online will charge people not just for the base retail game, but also for a monthly subscription to sort of keep a profit over the cost of the servers. But then in 2004 came the outlier and the most popular MMO example, Blizzard's World of Warcraft, coming fresh after the release of Warcraft 3 and its expansion, The Frozen Throne, which to this day is the most successful MMO ever living today, constantly flowing with new expansions, new updates, new content, and of course, a more sustainable player base. World of Warcraft and other subsequent MMOs were the earliest cases of live service games ever conceived in the gaming industry. The concept of a live service game is a game that keeps on living perpetually and constantly with new content just so that the revenue flow keeps going on ad infinitum. That's why games like World of Warcraft not only run under a monthly subscription price, but also today have other ways to keep the revenue afloat: microtransactions, in game services, and so on. Surely, as well, World of Warcraft players early in their teenage years and without a real occupation other than high school and a sort had plenty of time to play World of Warcraft. Surely, a lot of kids and teens had plenty of time to play video games, and it is today with games of today that and the Zoomers and Gen Alpha kids. And World of Warcraft consumed time more from their players into a grind of search to reach the highest level cap in the game, as well as other things. I remember most of my formative years were spent in World of Warcraft with my only dwarf warrior character going in this whole journey to reach max level. And the way World of Warcraft's leveling was designed back then was a tiny bit frustrating. But as an emergent experience of sorts, it kind of worked because the whole world was so immersive. It felt like you were part of this whole Tolkien-esque adventure through killing gnolls or dragons, and it was definitely gripping. I don't think I have the sense that they make games like these anymore. But we're talking about early live service infancy. Sure, WoW is one success story in the live service gaming industry, but there's another game in 2007, 3 years later, from Valve that will set forth trends in how the gaming industry monetizes their games. That is the FPS glass-based game Team Fortress 2. I think you already know what Team Fortress 2 is, so I'll get straightforward to the gist of it. Team Fortress 2 was a constant array of pushing updates after updates after updates with new content, and especially cosmetics, game modes, events, and so on. But the cherry on top of this game was its innovations in terms of monetizing their content.
Team Fortress 2 has become an institution among gamers and fans. There have been annual events, more maps and game modes, and many, many hats. All the while, Valve has not added any new classes that would have dramatically changed the base gameplay. Some have argued that the game is a lot messier now, with all the new options and modes, but it has been a small price to pay for its continued success. When it comes to the potential and impact of games as a service, Team Fortress 2 is the undisputed poster child for what that feature can do for a game.
The crates with random cosmetics, even rare ones sometimes, was a Kickstarter for the whole loot boxes dilemma that will continue on to this day. The game is a fashion show where its cosmetics take a key part into the economics of the game itself. And these monetization models translated well into other Valve games like CSGO or Dota 2. And while Riot Games' League of Legends has been doing microtransactions as a free-to-play game way before Team Fortress 2 come to be the money milking machine, most likely, Riot ever since has started taking notes from Valve and established a more constant push of new content on a more frequent basis, most likely now in the form of new seasons or annual events. Of course, a lot of the AAA game companies, either on desktop, console, or mobile, started taking notes from Valve, and Riot as well in terms of how to create monetization schemes and their live service games. And sure, a lot of the games were outlived by these two titans even since the dawn of the MMO genre. But despite the graveyard of live service game MMOs, MOBAs, and class based shooters start to get occupied, this system was profitable for the outliers of the industry. But there's one game that outclassed that live service trend for a while. By then, games like DayZ, H1Z1, and PUBG will have started the Battle Royale boom. And you know what it is. It's based loosely on a movie with the same name than the genre itself. You put 100 people on an island, and the last one standing has to be the one that survives and scavenges long enough to outsmart the other 99 players. A novel concept of gaming by then, but one game stood on top of them, eventually, like the game to rule them all. Fortnite was made by Epic Games originally as a four-player co-op based building tower defense shooter game in July 2017. And this particular section of the game was not the piece of the cake that was taken by everyone in terms of chasing the trend. Instead, it's free to play all sub game of Battle Royale, which was launched in September 2017, utterly and devastatingly eclipsed the original Save the World game mode. You see, what happened here is while the game was crawling it by its very early stages of development, way back before the Battle Royale was made, Tencent was a titan of the live service game industry in China, at least. And Tencent knew very well what they were doing with their live service games back then. So Epic Games approached Tencent for help, seeking their input on turning the Fortnite game into a live service one. So Tencent agreed to help and supply additional financial resources and expertise in exchange for purchasing a 40% stake in the company, to which Epic agreed. This has led to the resignation of notable Epic Games figures like Cliff Blasinski, who left Epic Games in disillusionment with the new Epic and Tencent merger deal. Perhaps Cliffy B saw what was pretty much going. Regardless, Fortnite became financially a smash hit, the biggest success in the live service game genre, oftentimes bringing even big name collaborations to the game itself, such as Marshmello, Travis Scott, Marvel, and so on. But behind this facade of success, it seemed apparent that Fortnite has some insidious tricks behind their sleeve. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been so financially successful to be the top live service game still surviving today. One of the key insidious tricks of exploitative business practices Fortnite does behind its success were psychological tactics like FOMO, fear of missing out, often driving players into to blindly spend money even on battle passes in a false sense of urgency if they want to be a part of the cool kids with the cool skins, especially at events like the Marshmallow concert, which had a predetermined set of skins, emotes, and other cosmetics that set paying players in the group of experiencing the live experience. This created a form of manufactured discontent, a concept I borrowed from a previous video about folding ideas, by the way, which limits free players as a deliberate design choice that puts forward certain ethical concerns in game design. The insidious business practices didn't end there because at all these big name collaborations with personalities like Marshmallow, Travis Scott, corporations like Marvel, Disney, brands like Star Wars, Rick and Morty even managed to work as free marketing for the game, as collaborating with these brands and personalities were publicity stunts designed to market the game into a driving engagement and market visibility. There's no denying about it, and no one was complaining about it either. At least not the people who did have enough neurons to notice the patterns that early, alongside the unethical business practices behind Fortnite. Epic Games was pulling off deliberate, unethical game design choices in the sense that they even started being psychologists the same way the mobile game market was doing to further exploit the minds of impressionable consumers into spending more money. And because of this, Fortnite became a very easy money printing machine for Epic. Fortnite popularized the concept of games as a service so much astronomically, so much so that other developers and publishers started to, well, taking notes from Epic Games and tried similar approaches to constant monetization of the live service games. Several other outliers in the industry were there, like Sea of Thieves or Overwatch, which were big name hits in the industry in some regard, and maybe not as much as Fortnite itself, but notable names in the live service games industry at least. But there was now a constant flurry of live service games coming up non-stop. Lawbreakers, Rumovers, Pokemon Go, Apex Legends. The list goes on, and it seems like the production of live service games chasing this set trend of live service games ramped up exponentially by then before 2020. You remember when I mentioned companies like Epic and other game companies have hired psychologists now? Well, what is an ingredient these games have in common and these psychologists on here are looking for in the games industry is addiction. They seek creating an addiction in players just so they keep pumping up attention and money, especially attention, which I'll tackle later, since it's seemingly a moneymaker by itself. To succeed in these games, you have to, as a player, to grind hours and hours into the games. Daily rewards and loot boxes are designed the same way as a slot machine in a casino does to keep your brain hooked enough to check back in on a near constant basis and maybe spend some money. If you want to climb up the multiplayer ranks, you have to sink hours into the game. All these factors seemingly will slowly but surely erode a consumer's resistance to shell out for in game purchases, as well as the consumer's patience with these monetization models. The first one's free, a drug dealer will say. This will be the point where criticisms start to leverage a lot on these light service games, given to cases like Star Wars Battlefront 2 or FIFA, which sparked a whole debate and discourse around the use of loot boxes and other sorts of so called surprise mechanics, as EO will say, which seemingly they drew too close to legal gambling. Even governments like here in Spain had to start considering putting measures against these unregulated gambling loot boxes situations. In 2022, the Minister of Consumption, Alberto Garzón, in Spain, has initially planned to regulate against loot boxes and other similar unregulated gambling mechanics, such as the ones in FIFA or Star Wars Battlefront 2. This took a pertinent couple of years before the Ministry of Consumption in 2024 banned loot boxes for people under the legal age of to avoid addictive behaviors in children. The only problem with this is that it only seems to be a band aid solution to this gigantic problem because they forgot to account for neurodivergent adults or some other types of audiences as well as many other games and situations where even publishers circle around these restrictions in some way or another, hypothetically speaking. But I think I'm getting too ahead of myself. Notably, there has been, as usual, anomalies in the live service genre that seem to work, like the aforementioned Overwatch or even extraction shooter Escape from Tarkov, albeit to a lesser degree than Fortnite itself or so. But especially for these latter, companies like Activision Blizzard or Jagger that seem to struggle to recapture the success of Tarkov and try their shot at their trending genre of extraction shooters. And the live service game Graveyard as well, as early as that kept growing. Cases like Lawbreakers, for instance, did fail to capture the attention of the Overwatch crowd so much that it ended up under less than a feasible player base, according to Steam charts.
Labourers line up coffins along trenches in New York City's Hart Island, a desolate strip of land accessed only by boat and used since the 19th century to bury those with no known next of kin. Normally 25 bodies are laid to rest here each week, but since the COVID outbreak gripped New York, they're burying almost that many a day.
Then COVID-19 came around in 2020 and it was a mess. It'll seem like the whole world was frozen over due to the massive restrictions that the pandemic imposed on the whole world while possibly waiting to die off and get a vaccine. People were locked down in their homes in quarantine, so they have nothing much to do and they ended up bored as hell. Social distancing measures impeded people from accessing offices and workplaces all around the globe. And Jim Flynn forbid if you wanted to organize something like E3 or gather a mass of people around somewhere in the middle of the very pandemic. Mostly because of these restrictions, video game production has dramatically slowed down to a degree where people started adopting a work from home schedule, combining both their labor with their homework of taking care of their families at home during the lockdown as video game developers. I myself work on a tiny little video game even during the lockdown because I was devoid of being able to access my workplace entirely and work where I work at my usual day job. However, and big however, by the way, people being locked down in their homes during the pandemic and did drive them to massive boredom and plenty of spare time. So more people were able to not just play video games but also consume video games as a way to seek refuge from the cruel realities of the real world pandemic. So, this led to a massive increase in video game sales and other related revenue regarding video game consumption. The games that obviously did seem to benefit the most from these mid pandemic sales and revenue were the usual suspect live service games: Fortnite, Call of Duty, League of Legends, Overwatch, all live service games that seem to benefit whole from this soaring surplus of disposable income and time pouring into them in mass. And that did not just affect microtransaction sales, but video game sales as well, especially digital. I say this because two game prime examples of recent breaking success during the pandemic were the due to of Doom Eternal and Animal Crossing, which both became a whole cultural phenomenon by itself. This, in combination with the skyrocketing viewership on streaming sites during the COVID-19 pandemic, did help game companies to find certain surplus in games and revenue. But you know how this will go. This video isn't about the success story of live service games as of late. Many, and I mean many live service games were momentarily and temporarily successful during this time period of the pandemic. But they did by debate, hook, line, and sinker, and this only looked up like the beginning of the end. Despite everything, companies like EA are heavily committed, albeit with a certain short sighted attitude, to the live service model. Their end to the March 2023 financial year marked a share of the full game purchases of just 26%, but the remaining 74% of the shares came from live services and other revenue sources, such as microtransactions. Most of EA's microtransactions, for instance, and their revenue came from games like FIFA or Madden, with their Ultimate Team in game pack stores, which will still be the sort of loot box unregulated gambling that I mentioned before. A court case between Epic Games and Apple even has seemingly revealed that 97% of the 2019 game's revenue came from Fortnite's cosmetics, showcasing that in fact these practices of game design still did work at some degree. A media consumer survey made in 2023, according to an article that did research on about this particular topic, has cited, and I quote, 40% chose AAA, 29% chose in game purchases, and 31% chose multiple indies. Meaning that 40% of game consumers would rather spend $70 on one single AAA game than to spend the same amount on more indie games or microtransactions. A hefty load of game developers attempted to capitalize on the live service trend by trying to adapt even their existing franchises into live services. Bethesda, who own the rights to Doom and Fallout, is the company most guilty of this. They created games like Fallout 76 and Redfall, the former turning Fallout into an MMO, and the latter being a sort of original IP of sorts. Bethesda did seem to add live service elements as well in games like Wolfenstein Youngblood and Doom Eternal, including cosmetic microtransactions, paid XP boosts, and even tacked on multiplayer modes no one asked for. In 2022, Sony Chief Financial Officer Hiroki Totoki, I hope I don't butcher the pronunciation, even announced that the company planned to launch 10 live service games by 2026. Sure, there are some anomalies in all of this too, like Helldivers 2 way later in 2024, but that was because mainly because of the game wasn't so in your face with the monetization, and it was more of a stellar emergent gaming experience. Check out our video on Helldivers 2, you know what I'm talking about. But regardless, these microtransactions were proven to be far from a silver bullet solution for success, since recent commercial underperformance of these games led to server closures and other sorts of really ugly things, like even layoffs and studio closures. The aforementioned Fallout 76 and Redfall were proven to be some of the most infamous botch launches in recent history, resulting not just in layoffs, but also in the closure of Arcane Studios, a reputable developer under Bethesda, and now Microsoft, who were as well responsible for the Dishonored franchise, among other games. Trouble also appears on Epic Games as they will lay off 900 employees, at first presumably and partially due to Fortnite's quote unquote creator driven shift. But then it was revealed in a leaked email sent to staff by Tim Sweeney, CEO of Epic Games, as they were spending way more money than they earn. In other words, in an attempt to make Fortnite profitable again, not only they had to cut costs laying off employees, but also they have to follow the trend set by games like Roblox. The irony nearly writes itself. As well as layoffs, studio closures, and server closures, a lot of prior game projects as well have been cancelled, such as in the case of some Niantic's games, who, in a showcase of how they became victims of their own success with Pokemon Go, they canceled a bunch of live service AR mobile games to focus primarily on said Pokemon Go. The graveyard of live service games grew even more exponentially in the amount of games that will lay their final rest in there. Rumbleverse, Marvel's Avengers, Apex Legends Mobile, even games like Creative Assembly's Hyenas, an extraction shooter which faced a very large development hell plagued with by creative indecision, was eventually canned in September 2023 after a solemn JPEG stating so. Other games like Babylon's Fall from Square Enix died off because they had the massive goal to charge full retail $70 price while heavily pushing microtransactions in your face alongside a battle pass system, lasting less than a year before having its servers shut down. Marvel's Avengers, for instance, also from Square, followed a similar problem to that of Babylon's Fall, pushing microtransactions real hard and on top of the full retail price, and in January 2023 they ended support, shut down servers, and delisted the game later that year, as if it never existed before. Anthem as well, the BioWare and EA looter shooter that tried so hard to imitate Bungie's Destiny too closely, pulled support 2 years after its initial release. That's a ton of noticeable patterns in these live service games and how they manage to be so short lived. A lot of these games face backlash and criticism on all corners of the internet regarding the invasive and predatory monetization schemes, including microtransactions and battle passes on top of their full AAA retail price. So it shows how microtransactions in a retail game are not a risk free bet, ironically enough, as these companies initially thought. There were other factors in the search of criticisms towards these short lived live service games contributing to the downfall of such, and one of them is the obvious market oversaturation. Too many live service games competing for the attention of every gamer and trying to monopolize it. Other factors can be the rise in development costs, although none of these companies really disclose where most of the costs go outside the actual development of costs that don't involve marketing or the salaries of executives. And also, a lot of trends like the Battle Royale boom or the extraction shooter genre start to cool down and die off with time, meaning that capitalizing on those trends might be a riskier bet these days. A more infamous case of server shutdown through Wolves said a precedent of how this creates a gigantic problem of video game preservation that is too complicated, and that is the crew, which servers shut down in 2024, which caused not only to some more dedicated players creating player developed versions of the game, but also to kickstart the Stop Killing Games EU initiative, spearheaded by YouTuber Occurs Farms in 2024, an initiative that will force and obligate game publishers to stop orphaning their live service games when they are no longer profitable, creating offline versions in the process. But the most recent case of video game live service failure that we know to date, and the most notorious one, is nothing more than Sony's Concord in 2024. Concord was yet another hero based shooter that tried too late to capitalize on the Overwatch made trend after 8 years of development. Its cast of characters, for instance, was too generic to stand out amongst a gigantic crowd of hero shooters, and basically there were to no redeeming qualities about the game either. The game was a commercial failure, only generating a total of 25,000 video game sales on all stores, making it the biggest flop to date, later to be killed off by Sony in less than 2 weeks, which is record time for a death of a live service game, eventually being delisted everywhere and not being mentioned anymore in an Orwellian fashion, as if Sony wanted us to forget entirely that it even existed at some point in video game history. This game only had 2 weeks to prove itself before dying, which is a sign of the impatience corporations like Sony tend to have when looking at games that don't instantly generate them enough massive revenue, in contrast to non-live service games like Astrobot. At this point, companies like Sony flew too close to the Fortnite and Overwatch sun and fell off. And speaking of which, even games like Fortnite, World of Warcraft, Overwatch, and so on, especially after the pandemic, have faced significant drops in player base, given to the fault of the attention economy that they're trying to desperately clinch on. World of Warcraft has stopped even showing subscriber numbers because of said dropping players. They became so ashamed of their constant losses at one point that they didn't even bother justifying their shareholders their own investments. The declining player bases of that happened post pandemic was clearly showing that this COVID 19 era increase in sales and revenue was only a mirage for many of these game publishers, an illusion that fooled them into chasing the live service game trend so hard that it ended in their own demise, a 6 feet under in a massive live service graveyard. As I said, one of the major key reasons for these games to fail is because they try to monopolize the attention consumers too much. And we all should have heard that attention, like time and money, are infinite but very valuable resources. It is pretty hard, like money and time, to acquire attention in a sea of other competitors that are trying to compete for the same amount of attention. Everything is like a cacophony of noise that's constantly trying to get your attention as quick and as easy as possible, just so it funnels them into quick revenue. There's only also such a finite time in a gamer's week in terms of that set attention to certain games, since live service games rely so heavily on recurrent spending and a constant supply of attention and time. Gaming consumers barely have the time to spend on all these live service games, which is a gigantic problem in a said world of attention inflation. I myself am not at home 100% of the time, let alone barely 50% of the time every week. I have a real job, especially after the COVID lockdown, and I need to work on the midweek, every day of it, away from video games. Not to mention the work I spend on videos like these on my leisure time. And that is pretty much similar to other people's cases as well. We're not the NES or PS1 addicted toddlers or teenagers with plenty of spare time anymore. We're grown adults with real occupations and real jobs, especially coming after a lockdown that prevented us from occupying time with actual jobs. Even then, according to the aforementioned media research made in 2023, the majority of gamers will only play one or two games in a given month because of those leisure time limitations. In the post COVID 19 era of revenue declines and the decline of attention spent in games, consumers exit their homes after the lockdown and spend money and time in the real world. It's no wonder that releases like Barbie and Oppenheimer in the movie theaters were turned into cultural moments like Barbenheimer, which again will later showcase how the movie industry is also keen on desperately following trends of said cultural moments and most of the time failing at them. There's too many live service games trying to monopolize, like I said, everyone's attention so much that it is really hard for each game to sustain vital levels of time spent. It will be obvious since game consumers spend on average 12.5 hours per week playing games that attention It's a very finite resource, more now than ever. Okay, for starters, this whole live service game demise needs an autopsy of sorts to know the oh so many problems they sort of imply in the gaming industry. There's problems in terms of game preservation for starters. There's also labor and workers' rights problems as well, aside of from many other problems regarding the constant chasing of trends in the industry and how the game industry is doomed to not be able to learn from the mistakes of the past. We have to obviously start at the glaring problems regarding video game preservation. Live service games are designed to change very often and add new seasons, events, and updates to get players hooked into spending time into them and buy their collectibles and cosmetics. This usually requires big updates where studios might have a fewer times than you think back up previous versions of in their entirety, like in rare cases like World of Warcraft Classic and the sort. But with seasons and updates happening so quickly, it's usually an afterthought when running live service games. If you're trying to play an old version of the game, forget about it. You can't get it back most of the time, and even if you did, servers will impede you from joining games as all the current version players can't play with you. It's basically a nightmare. You have to especially consider that there's barely to no effort preserving all versions of games, or hell, even old games. And as this is a constant afterthought, barely addressed in the majority of the game publishers today. Old source codes for all games get lost in the dirt and dust a lot of times, and even overwritten by newer source code over time in some cases. And there are a lot of IPs where publishers sit on and do nothing about. Even as of video game preservation concerns, a lot of live service games age and drop in popularity. They're not able to always keep the same player base all the time. So when there's not enough popularity to maintain those games alive, their servers eventually are no longer viable to the publisher, and they're eventually shut down for good, leaving most of the time an expensive paperweight on consumers themselves to be able to do nothing with. Initiatives like Stop Killing Games, albeit often criticized by other sorts of industry plans in general, are still noble things to consider. But as noble as they might be and as valid as they might be, they miss an important part of why preserving these games is difficult, and not because of the fault of these initiatives, but rather because of the fault of the industry as of now in general. In terms of the interest of executives from game publishers, the sheer amount of code that will be needed to be written for an offline mode is immense because of games are designed for server to client communication and nothing else. And asking to cut that or enable private server hosting is almost as complex as asking the publisher executives while wanting to save costs in development so the stock price goes perpetually up for shareholders to design the game again. And no video game executive nor shareholder will be willing to allow that. Another game glaring problem that's the cause of the downfall of the live service games is that obvious market oversaturation. There is only so much space in the market for live service games, and what works for games like Fortnite or hell, even World of Warcraft, may not work for other games, especially with a weird mix-up match of monetization strategies. Publishers are all trying to figure out through their trial and error what works for their games. Most successful indie titles do not have microtransactions, or if they do, they are strictly cosmetic and as damning as that might be, but not so in your face as AAA titles. AAA titles like Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom even fully found major success rejecting the live service model. The gaming industry, especially the AAA gaming industry, is stuck and locked in a holding pattern. If you scroll through the endless feeds of the majority of platforms of gaming stores like Steam, the Nintendo eShop, or similar, you only see a sea of remakes and remasters, a plethora of live service games that at this point won't probably survive long enough to tell the tale, and so called safe bets in the industry that are too safe and generic to be successful in the sea of other safe bets. It's usual then that the losses in revenue these gaming companies have after the pandemic will imply then in cutting down and killing live service games to cut costs and take a false sense of growth to shareholders. so they pump up stock prices because, after all, most of these AAA game companies are publicly traded in the stock market. And one of the end results of these game murders is a so called restructuring of companies, which lead to mass layoffs, as they've been happening since 2023 in mass, which is the other big giant problem that led to live service games industry to fall off, and indicate that this isn't a problem of the industry's inherent instability, but a problem of exploitation. Video game labor exploitation has been existing since the dawn of video games itself. You only need to hear horror stories from the 90s, like the cases of id Software or Rockstar Games, to know fully well that it has been a thing since the very beginning. After all, video game companies only care about money these days. But this leads to a worker situation more recently, where even if you believe you found yourself in the right job at a gaming company, it can evaporate in an instant because of the whims of a video game executive or shareholder somewhere, throwing you then to suddenly compete against hundreds of thousands of people for every job position in the video game industry market. Over 20,000 people have been laid off as a consequence of the same bad leadership in a majority of the gaming industry, and the number of layoffs keeps growing to this day, despite most of these game corporations surpassing the revenues of the music and film industry combined. Back in 2023, even, a lot of people or companies could barely point to any one reason that the live service games are having such a bad run, especially since it seems some of the high profile stories about the field didn't seem to center on games that weren't released by that moment. But the variables and patterns are there, such as the aforementioned reasons and more. And I'll tell you the main reason now why these live service games are dying and failing. It is because of a greedy executive class and shareholder class constantly obsessed with stock prices going up, who have no idea of how the basics of the gaming industry work. Every decision made by these executives at the gaming industry for these live service games has to do always with boosting stock market share prices, while the mainstream press often is complacent and often lends legitimacy to corporate friendly narratives made by game publishers about how the industry simply has a cultural problem. You are apparently not laid off of the company because we wanted to pump up the stock market share price of our company. You're simply fired because you're too lazy to keep up with with our standards, despite the fact that we, the executive class, sit there and do nothing on top of the money you're making us. The massive gaming corporations of the gaming industry expected infinite growth, an infinite money printing machine that swallows attention wholesale, while market saturation has shown not only to be their greatest strength, but also their own particular Achilles heel. Why would you want to go to the latest cookie cutter milquetoast shooter for a spin when you can just go to Call of Duty or Fortnite, whose mechanics nearly everyone is familiar with? This is more evident with the case of Concord even. 8 whole years of development since the dawn of games like Overwatch setting the past trend, just to capitalize on said trend too little too late. You think game executives will know the risk beforehand before deciding to set the game companies on ride such old trends and not randomly chase the dragon of infinite stock price growth, that they are capable of rational decisions. But this isn't rational. This is short-sighted and is costing the livelihoods of tons of people under them. This must stop. This is the same short-sightedness that leads video game executives to drool over facts like NFTs and AI. The lessons of the industry won't be learned because the people ruling the industry, albeit the few of them, are not physically or mentally capable of grasping the very concepts behind those lessons. They live as nepo babies under the riches of inheritance of their already rich family members without any sort of struggle that a worker class citizen may face, just because the system is designed as this, the system of capitalism. It was understandable that up until 2023, most likely, was very hard to predict the future of the live service games unless you were someone like me or Stephanie Sterling with some sort of Cassandra complex, noticing obvious patterns in the industry while no one is listening. And a lot of people stopped acting like they knew what the future will hold after Donald Trump was elected president of the United States of America in 2016, and the video game industry lost its mind chasing the make-believe value of monkey JPEGs, only to later make some JPEGs trying to make up for the lost PR. But I can tell you now that the future of live service games will hold for everyone. Live service games are dead, and the AAA game industry won't ever learn anything from that. Let's face it. There's people at the top making a lot of money, and then there's the people at the bottom making the things that make the people a lot of on the top of that money. The people under are not getting paid what they should be getting paid. Often they struggle paying rent or having 2 or 3 jobs to be able to scrape for paying said rent, and are being obviously exploited by said people on top. All in the while, the same game executives and shareholders will most likely never learn from the mistakes of the past, let alone the mistakes that led to the video game crash of 1983, all because video game executives and shareholders don't seem to understand the most basic knowledge about how even video games and their audiences work. This is demonstrated in other industries as well, because the rich class are a bunch of ignorant idiots chasing infinite revenue growth at the expense of those under them. This is the old tale of capitalism, as it is the natural, or rather unnatural, extension of feudalism, a system that has people on the top ruling for nonsense excuses, a few privileged bourgeois men and women who are blindsided by their own greed and have grown within the privilege of not having a single struggle in their lives due to their expensive perpetual riches of family inheritances. They get to rule because they say they can rule over everyone else. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought of himself, saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was a real founder of civil society. For how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch, and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.' These impostors are the ones making us believe society will work without a few ruling over many, or through the power of some dollar bills and privilege. This is the false basis from which capitalism works through these malign systems designed to be malign themselves. People who are smart enough to maneuver their lives and tell us their system is working, but dumb enough to make blind decisions, especially in the gaming industry, as they do not understand the feelings of worker class game consumers. This system, let me tell you, it will die, and from it a new, more egalitarian society will be born. The status quo of a few ruling over many has existed since the dawn of humanity in itself, and death, like it, has existed since the birth of the very universe. It is a cycle of life and death itself. Capitalism has an expiration date like many of these live service games, uncertain, that is, but an expiration date nonetheless, because this very system will eventually collapse on itself, and we must ensure that we must expire this unfair system as slow as long term that might be at an uncertain date. All will come in its due time with enough effort. If you're a worker in the video game industry who feels exploited, I can tell you this tidbit of advice. Organize. Organize for the sake of a better society, and organize so the worker class people like you can fight for not just better working conditions, but also for a better society. But for now, it seems that the time has come for live service games to die, and it is time for live service games to lay their final rest. Farewell.